They accused me of being unstable in the middle of a child's birthday party, loud enough that people 2 tables over stopped chewing. It was Rashad's nephew's party, his family's event, his people, his rules. The picnic tables were lined in rows near the grills, balloons taped to the fence, juice boxes sweating in the sun. Kids screamed over a rented bounce house that thumped and sagged on one corner. Kenya had her phone out like she always did at family events, cake, gifts, speeches, so nobody thought twice when the camera kept floating our way. And then my mother-in-law Latoya started listing my concerns like she was reading from a clipboard. My spending. My parenting. My moods. Each sentence landed harder because it wasn't just her voice. It was the pauses between words, like she was waiting for agreement. I felt my face burn. I opened my mouth to answer, to defend myself, to say anything at all. That's when my husband Rashad squeezed my hand under the table. Not hard. Controlled. A warning. Don't make this worse, he whispered, leaning close like he was protecting me. Across from us, his sister Kenya watched my face instead of the cake. Someone lifted a phone. Someone else nodded like they'd heard this before. I realized, too late, that no one looked surprised. I tried to explain anyway. Just a sentence. Just context. But every word I said was met with a sigh or a shake of the head. Calm voices followed me, correcting me. Soft concern wrapped around sharp judgment. It felt rehearsed. The same phrases. The same timing. Like cues. My daughter Kalia tugged my sleeve and asked if we were leaving. My son Jabari hid behind my chair, confused by the sudden quiet around us. I caught Rashad's eye, waiting for him to step in. He didn't. He stared at his plate like this wasn't happening to us. That's when I understood the silence wasn't confusion. It was strategy. I stopped talking. I rested my hand on my purse. I smiled for the kids, with people watching and phones still out, and I made a promise to myself. If they were turning my humiliation into evidence, I would make sure the record told the truth. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories coming soon. Before that birthday party, my life didn't look dramatic from the outside. Busy, yes. Strained, maybe. But broken? No. I'm Auntie Johnson, and most days started the same. Lunches packed before sunrise. Shoes lined up by the door. A quick check of backpacks before I woke my daughter Kalia Johnson, 8, sharp and observant in ways that worried me sometimes, and my son Jabari Johnson, 5, gentle, always humming to himself while he brushed his teeth. My husband Rashad Johnson liked order. Schedules. Quiet mornings. He worked long hours and spoke in solutions, not feelings. When I tried to talk about being tired or overwhelmed, he'd nod and say, "We'll figure it out," without ever asking how. Still, I believed we were a team. We lived in a constant shuffle, school drop-offs, work, dinners that got colder than they should have. Rashad spent more time on his phone than with us, but I told myself that was stress. His family called often. Latoya. Kenya. Always checking in. Always concerned. I didn't notice at first how those calls ended right when I walked into the room. At family gatherings, conversations would pause. Not stop, just shift. Compliments wrapped around quiet critiques. Jokes that landed a little too close to home. I laughed them off because that felt easier than pushing back. Rashad never joined in, but he didn't stop them either. When I asked later if something was wrong, he said I was reading into things. "Everyone's just worried about you," he told me once, like that explained everything. I believed him. Or maybe I needed to. Because believing meant I didn't have to imagine that the people closest to me were already watching, measuring, and taking notes. The small things started adding up in ways I couldn't name at the time. Rashad's family didn't criticize me outright. Not directly. It was always framed as help. Suggestions. Worry. Latoya would tilt her head and ask if I was getting enough rest lately. Kenya would comment on how tired the kids looked, then laugh and say she meant it kindly. I learned to answer carefully. If I pushed back, the room cooled. If I stayed quiet, the conversation moved on. Rashad watched all of it like a referee who never blew the whistle. Later, when I asked why no one defended me, he said stepping in would make things awkward. That word stuck with me. Awkward. It became the excuse for everything. Why comments weren't corrected. Why jokes landed on me and stayed there. Why concern always seemed to point in one direction. At home, I tried to talk it through. I told Rashad I felt judged. That I felt watched. He sighed, rubbed his face, and said his family was just protective. That I took things personally when I was stressed. You've been on edge lately, he added once, casually, like an observation. I remember freezing. Not because it was cruel, but because it sounded practiced. Like something he'd said before. Somewhere else. After that, I started noticing patterns. Conversations that repeated themselves almost word for word. Questions that came in clusters, spaced just far enough apart to feel natural. I'd answer one person, then hear the same concern from someone else a week later. And always, Rashad stayed neutral. Calm. Silent. I told myself silence meant loyalty. That if he wasn't against me, he was with me. I didn't yet understand that silence can be a position all on its own. The invitation to Rashad's nephew's birthday came through the family group chat like a peace offering. Bright emojis. Exclamation points. A message about bringing everyone together. It was being held at a park halfway between our places, which Rashad pointed out like it was proof of good intentions. Neutral ground. Easy. I hesitated before responding. Not because of the kids, they loved parties, but because something in my stomach tightened when I read it. A quiet warning I couldn't explain. Rashad noticed and smiled, slow and reassuring. He said it would be good for us. That showing up mattered. That avoiding family only fed the wrong narrative. What narrative? I asked. He shrugged. Said I was overthinking again. That word. Again. In the days leading up to the party, the calls increased. Latoya checked in twice about what time we'd arrive. Kenya asked what I was bringing, then followed up with a reminder about keeping things simple. Even his brother Terrence sent a message about parking in crowds, like logistics were suddenly a shared concern. It felt like being prepared for something I didn't know was coming. The night before, I laid out the kids' clothes and tried to shake the feeling. I told myself this was normal. Families were messy. I was tired. Stress made everything feel sharper than it was. Rashad didn't talk much that evening. He scrolled on his phone while I packed snacks and wipes, nodded when I spoke, answered in short sentences. When I asked if everything was okay, he said yes too quickly. In bed, I stared at the ceiling and replayed every comment, every look, every pause from the past few months. I promised myself that if anything felt off at the party, I would stay calm. Smile. Leave early if I had to. I had no idea calm was exactly what they were counting on me to lose. The park was already loud when we arrived, the kind of noise that feels cheerful until you're standing in the middle of it. It was a public park in Atlanta, Georgia, bright with picnic tables and a rented bounce house sagging slightly on one side. Music played from a portable speaker. Kids ran barefoot through the grass. From a distance, it looked like any other family gathering. Up close, I felt the shift. Conversations paused when we walked up. Not fully. Just enough. Eyes flicked toward me, then away. Smiles held a second too long. Rashad greeted everyone easily, like nothing in the world was wrong. He hugged Latoya. Clapped Terrence on the shoulder. Kenya waved and kept watching me instead of the kids. I set the presents down and helped Kalia and Jabari with their shoes. I could feel people listening before I heard them. She looks tired, someone said nearby. Probably a lot on her plate, another voice added softly. I focused on the kids. Juice boxes. Sunscreen. Normal things. Rashad disappeared into a group of men near the grill. I watched him laugh at something I couldn't hear. For a moment, I felt foolish for worrying. Maybe I really had imagined it all. Then Latoya called everyone's attention. Not sharply. Casually. Like she was starting a toast. She talked about family. About stability. About how children need consistency. Each sentence landed closer to me than the last. Heads nodded. Someone murmured agreement. I felt my pulse in my ears. I looked for Rashad. He was close enough to hear every word. He didn't look at me. That was the moment the pit in my stomach opened. Because concern doesn't need an audience. And whatever this was, it was being performed. Once it started, it didn't stop. The comments came from different directions, but they sounded the same. Questions framed as worry. Observations wrapped in sympathy. Someone mentioned how often the kids missed school when they were sick. Someone else wondered out loud if I was managing everything okay. I answered calmly at first. Short sentences. Facts. I smiled when I spoke, because I knew eyes were on me. I could feel it, people watching not just what I said, but how I said it. My tone. My face. My hands. Every response I gave was met with a gentle correction. Oh, I didn't mean it like that. We're just concerned. No one's attacking you. The word attacking hung in the air, even though no one had accused me of that. I finally turned to Rashad. I didn't say his name. I just looked at him, waiting. He met my eyes for half a second, then looked away. That's when he leaned in and took my hand. His grip was steady. Controlled. His voice was low, meant only for me. Don't make this worse. Worse than what? Being questioned in front of strangers? Worse than having my parenting dissected like a group project? Before I could answer, Kenya jumped in, speaking louder now. She talked about how everyone's noticed I'd been emotional lately. How stress can affect judgment. Heads nodded again. Someone lifted a phone, pretending to check a message. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Recognition. This wasn't a conversation. It was a setup. And every calm word they used was designed to make any reaction from me look exactly the way they wanted. I stopped answering after that. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I finally understood the rules of the room. Every word I offered was being weighed. Not for truth, but for usefulness. Calm could be twisted into avoidance. Emotion could be labeled instability. Silence would be framed as guilt. So I chose a different kind of quiet. I focused on Kalia, who stood close enough that her arm brushed my leg. Her eyes kept moving between faces, trying to read the adults the way kids do when something feels wrong. Jabari tugged at my sleeve and asked if he could go back to the bounce house. His voice was small, unsure. Yes, I told him softly. Go play. As he ran off, I heard someone sigh behind me. A heavy sound. Disappointed. Like I'd just proven a point. Rashad stayed beside me, close enough to look supportive. He didn't say anything else. Didn't correct anyone. Didn't ask if I was okay. His silence wrapped around me tighter than his hand had. The conversation shifted, but it didn't move away from me. It hovered. I caught pieces of it drifting past. Words like patterns and concern and what's best for the kids. Always the kids. Always spoken like they weren't 10 feet away. I felt heat rise in my chest, the urge to defend myself pressing hard against my ribs. To list every late night, every doctor appointment, every sacrifice no one saw. Instead, I watched. I watched who spoke and who stayed quiet. Who repeated the same phrases. Who looked at their phones at the same moments. I watched Rashad nod once, barely noticeable, when Latoya spoke. That nod told me everything. This wasn't happening to him. It was being done with him. I excused myself to the restroom, even though I didn't need one. It was the only way to step out of the circle without it looking like retreat. I walked fast, past the picnic tables, past the bounce house, until the noise softened behind me. My hands were shaking by the time I reached the concrete building at the edge of the park. I locked myself into a stall and breathed. Not deep. Not calming. Just enough to keep from crying. In the quiet, the pieces started to line up. The repeated phrases. The careful tone. The way people watched instead of listened. This wasn't about helping me. It was about recording a version of me. One they could repeat later, together, without contradictions. I thought about the calls that ended when I entered the room. The comments that sounded rehearsed. Rashad's choice of words. On edge. Overthinking. Everyone's worried. I pulled my phone out of my purse, more out of habit than intention. The screen lit up with unread messages. Old threads. Group chats I'd muted because they stressed me out. I didn't open them yet. I wasn't ready. A knock came at the door. Kenya's voice, sweet and concerned, asking if I was okay. I said yes. I said I just needed a minute. Take your time, she replied. We're all here for you. I waited until her footsteps faded. When I stepped back outside, the party had moved on without me. Cake was being cut. Candles lit. Rashad stood with his family, smiling like the air hadn't shifted at all. He glanced at me once. Quick. Measuring. I walked back to my kids and sat down. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't leave early. I stayed. And that, I would learn later, frustrated them more than anything else. Staying changed the rhythm. The accusations didn't stop, but they softened. Shifted into glances and half-sentences. Comments said just loud enough to be overheard, then dismissed with smiles. The performance adapted when I didn't react. I sat on the edge of the picnic bench and watched the kids eat cake. Kalia kept looking back at me, like she was checking whether I was still there. I nodded every time our eyes met. Jabari smeared frosting on his face and laughed, unaware of the quiet tension folding in around us. Rashad stayed close, but not too close. He hovered in that careful space that looked supportive from the outside. If anyone had asked later, he could say he never left my side. I noticed how often phones were out now. Not obvious filming. Just constant checking. Screens angled slightly away from me, then back. Someone laughed and said they needed better lighting, like it was a joke. I caught Latoya whispering to Kenya. They both glanced at me, then away. The same pattern, over and over. Speak. Look. Wait. That's when it hit me. They weren't just trying to provoke me. They were trying to capture restraint. Silence. Stillness they could later twist into something else. Withdrawal. Disengagement. Proof. I felt cold then. Clear. Rashad leaned down and asked if I wanted to leave. His voice was gentle. Concerned. For a moment, I almost believed it. No, I said. I'm fine. He searched my face, like he was disappointed not to find what he'd expected. The party wrapped up shortly after. Hugs. Goodbyes. His family thanked me for coming, for being so calm. That word again. Calm, said like it was a condition. On the drive home, Rashad turned the radio on and didn't speak. Neither did I. But something inside me had already started recording everything. The house felt louder than the car ride had been. Kalia went straight to her room without saying much. Jabari asked for a snack even though he'd just had cake. Normal kid things, but the air between me and Rashad felt stretched thin, like one wrong word would tear it open. I unpacked leftovers while he stood at the counter, scrolling on his phone. The silence pressed harder than the accusations had. Finally, I asked what that was back there. He didn't look up. You embarrassed yourself, he said, calmly. Like a conclusion, not an opinion. I turned and stared at him. Asked how staying quiet was embarrassing. Asked how letting people talk about me like that was supposed to help anyone. He sighed, slow and patient, the way people do when they think they're explaining something obvious. They were just concerned. You didn't need to take it personally. There it was again. Concern. The word they all hid behind. I went to the bedroom and shut the door. Not to slam it. Just to create space. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled my phone out, my hands steadier now than they'd been all day. I opened the muted group chats. Messages stacked on messages. Timestamps lining up too neatly to ignore. Latoya reminding everyone to stay calm. Kenya suggesting exact phrases. Notes about not interrupting each other. About letting me show who I really am. And then Rashad's replies. Short. Measured. Familiar. Let her talk herself into trouble. Don't push too hard. We just need consistency. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I sat there, reading, scrolling back months, watching the pattern form in real time. The party wasn't the beginning. It was just the moment they decided to do it in public. When Rashad knocked on the door and asked if I was coming to bed, I locked my phone and said yes. I wasn't ready for confrontation. I was ready for proof. That night, I lay awake listening to Rashad breathe beside me. Slow. Even. Unbothered. The messages replayed in my mind every time I closed my eyes. The planning. The coordination. The way my reactions, my silence, had been discussed like variables in an experiment. I realized then how long this had been happening. How many conversations I'd walked into late. How many judgments had already been made without me. In the dark, I opened my phone again and took screenshots. One by one. I saved everything to a private folder and backed it up somewhere Rashad didn't know to look. Each tap felt deliberate. Quiet. Permanent. This wasn't rage. It was clarity. I thought about the kids. About how easily words like concern and stability could be used to rewrite a parent's entire identity. About how loudly people speak when they think the other side won't fight back. I also thought about how careful Rashad had been. Never cruel in public. Never aggressive. Just present enough to look reasonable. Just silent enough to let others do the damage. By morning, the shape of what was coming had settled in my chest. This wasn't just about disrespect or embarrassment anymore. This was about custody. About leverage. About painting me into a corner where defending myself would only make me look worse. I got up before anyone else. Made breakfast. Packed lunches. Kissed the kids on the forehead like every other morning. Rashad asked if I was okay. I said yes. But something fundamental had broken overnight. Not my spirit. My assumptions. As I watched him leave for work, I understood that whatever came next would not be loud. It wouldn't be emotional. And it wouldn't be rushed. They had planned a story about me. Now I was going to make sure the record told mine. The next morning felt deceptively normal. I made coffee. Packed lunches. Signed a permission slip I'd forgotten the night before. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had shifted into focus. Once the kids were at school, I sat at the kitchen table with my phone and opened the messages again. This time, I didn't read them like a wife trying to understand. I read them like someone building a timeline. Dates. Gaps. Repeated phrases. I scrolled back months and realized how long I'd been stepping into conversations already decided without me. How often concern appeared right after I disagreed with something. How quickly my reactions were shared, summarized, softened, and repackaged. I took notes. Not emotional ones. Factual ones. At noon, Rashad texted to ask if we were okay. If I was still upset. The wording was careful. Neutral. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. We're fine. That was it. In the afternoon, I called my sister, Desiree Brookshire. I didn't tell her everything. Not yet. I asked neutral questions, whether she'd noticed anything off, whether she remembered the comments at family gatherings. She paused longer than usual before answering. I didn't want to say anything, she said. But yeah. It always felt rehearsed. Then she put me on speaker. My brother, Marquis Brookshire, didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. That wasn't concern, he said. That was coordination. By evening, I had organized the screenshots into folders. One for planning. One for execution. One for Rashad's replies. I backed everything up twice. I didn't confront him. I didn't hint. I didn't cry. Because confrontation would warn them. And for the first time since that party, I understood something important. Silence wasn't weakness. It was leverage. 2 days passed without incident, which told me more than any argument could have. Rashad didn't apologize. He didn't bring the party up again. He acted like calm had reset the board, like the moment had expired because I hadn't exploded. That alone confirmed what I'd seen in the messages. This was never about resolution. It was about outcome. I started paying attention to what he said when he thought nothing was wrong. He mentioned the kids' schedules more often. Asked casual questions about school pickup times, doctor appointments, who watched them when I ran errands. His tone stayed light, but the questions stacked too neatly to be coincidence. I answered simply. Truthfully. I gave him nothing extra. That afternoon, Latoya called. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was soft, concerned, and vague. She said she just wanted to check in. Said everyone loved me. Said they worried when I seemed overwhelmed. I saved it. Later, Kenya texted a link to an article about co-parenting during stressful seasons, followed by a heart emoji. I didn't respond. I screenshotted it and added it to the folder labeled pattern. That night, after the kids were asleep, I opened my calendar and started marking dates. Family events. Arguments. Comments that had stayed with me. When I lined them up against the messages, the overlap was undeniable. Every moment of concern followed a disagreement. Every public comment came after a private boundary. I realized then that the party wasn't a one-off. It was a test run. A dress rehearsal to see how I'd behave with an audience. Rashad watched me from the couch while I worked. He asked what I was doing. Planning, I said. He smiled, relieved. He thought he knew what that meant. He didn't realize I was already planning for a future where my calm mattered more than his explanations ever would. I waited a full week before calling an attorney. Not because I doubted myself, but because I needed to be sure. Sure that this wasn't just hurt feelings hardened into suspicion. Sure that what I was seeing would hold up outside my own head. I found Antoine Reynolds through a quiet recommendation. No ads. No flashy website. Just a name passed along with a pause and a sentence that stuck with me. He listens before he talks. That mattered. When I sat across from him, I didn't start with the party. I started with my marriage. The slow shift. The silence. The concern that always seemed to move in one direction. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react. He let me finish. Then I slid my phone across the desk. He took his time reading. Scrolled. Went back. Checked timestamps. His expression didn't change, but the room did. Something settled into place. This isn't emotional, he said finally. It's coordinated. Hearing it out loud made my chest tighten, not from fear, but from validation. He explained the difference between bad family dynamics and intentional narrative building. Between worry and documentation. Between noise and planning. He told me not to confront anyone. Not yet. He said reactions were exactly what these situations fed on. That restraint wasn't just smart, it was protective. Custody cases don't hinge on volume, he said. They hinge on patterns. He asked me to start keeping a log. Dates. Calls. Messages. any interaction involving the kids. Not interpretations. Just facts. When I left his office, the sun felt too bright. The city moved around me like nothing had happened. But something had. I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't overthinking. I had crossed from suspicion into strategy. Following Antoine's advice felt harder than I expected. Logging facts instead of feelings meant resisting the urge to explain myself, even in my own notes. I wrote times. Dates. Who said what? Who was present? I didn't add tone or intention. Just actions. At first, it felt cold. Then it felt powerful. Rashad noticed the change before he understood it. I stopped filling the silence. Stopped volunteering context. When he asked questions, I answered plainly and moved on. No stories. No justifications. He began circling back, asking the same things in slightly different ways, like he was checking for inconsistencies. One evening, he asked why I'd been writing so much. Just organizing, I said, without looking up. He laughed softly and said I'd always been detail-oriented. The comment sounded like praise, but his eyes stayed on the notebook longer than they needed to. The next day, LaToya showed up at the school pickup. Not announced. Just standing near the gate like it was a coincidence. She hugged the kids, asked how they were doing, told other parents she was helping out more lately. I logged it. That night, Rashad mentioned how nice it was that his family was being supportive. How lucky the kids were to have so many people who cared. I didn't argue. Instead, I checked my phone and found a message from Kenya sent earlier that day. A reminder to keep things calm around the kids. To avoid scenes. To think about how things look. I added it to the folder. For the first time, I could see the friction clearly. Not resistance. Not confrontation. Pressure. They were adjusting because I wasn't giving them what they needed anymore. No reactions. No cracks. Just a clean record that grew heavier by the day. And I understood then that every small move they made now wasn't random. It was a response to losing control. The pressure sharpened after that. Not openly. Not dramatically. It came in the form of proximity. Rashad stayed home more. Sat closer. Asked questions that sounded casual but landed with weight. How I was feeling. If I was overwhelmed. If I ever thought about taking a break. I answered the same way every time. Calm. Brief. Unremarkable. Inside, I tracked everything. One afternoon, Terrence stopped by unannounced. He said he was in the area. He commented on how quiet the house felt, how serious I seemed lately. He joked that I probably needed a girls' night, something to loosen me up. I logged it. That evening, Rashad brought up therapy. Not as an accusation. As a suggestion. He said it might help with stress. With balance. With perspective. I didn't say no. I said I'd think about it. That answer seemed to frustrate him more than refusal would have. He wanted certainty. Agreement. Something he could point to later. Instead, I kept moving at my own pace. A few days later, LaToya texted asking if she could take the kids overnight. Just to give me a break. I said no. Politely. With no explanation. The response came an hour later. Concern again. A reminder about how important support systems were. About not doing everything alone. I saved it. That night, I lay awake and felt the fear finally surface. Not panic. Not tears. A tight awareness of how easily concern could turn into control if left unchallenged. But fear didn't freeze me. It clarified me. Because every attempt to manage me now left a trace. And the more they tried to box me in gently, the clearer it became that restraint wasn't just survival anymore. It was the first move of taking my power back. My second meeting with Antoine was quieter than the first. I brought my notebook this time. The screenshots were already organized, but the log was new. Dates. Names. School pickup. Unannounced visits. Suggestions that sounded helpful until you lined them up. Antoine read without speaking. When he finished, he tapped the page once and looked at me. "They're building a soft case," he said. "Not an emergency one. That takes time." Time. That word landed heavy. He explained how custody disputes rarely start with court filings. They start with narratives. With witnesses who don't think of themselves as witnesses. With people who believe they're helping. They want to look reasonable, he said. "You're doing exactly what disrupts that." He warned me about escalation. That when calm doesn't work, pressure usually follows. Requests framed as care. Documentation disguised as concern. Sometimes formal steps, sometimes not. "What do I do if they push harder?" I asked. "You don't push back," he said. "You let them move first. And you keep records clean." He suggested a parenting app for communication. Neutral. Time-stamped. Harder to twist later. He also told me to expect a third party eventually. A school counselor. A mediator. Someone positioned as neutral. Walking out, I felt the weight of patience settle in. Strategy isn't fast. It doesn't feel satisfying in the moment. It feels unfinished. That afternoon, Rashad texted asking if we could talk later. He said he felt distance growing between us. Said he wanted to reconnect. I replied the way I'd learned to. Okay. One word. No tone. No emotion. When he came home, he watched me closely, like he was waiting for something to break through the calm. I smiled. I asked about his day. I made dinner. Nothing cracked. And I saw it then, the shift in his eyes. Not anger. Calculation giving way to uncertainty. For the first time since the party, he didn't know what I was going to do next. And that scared him more than any argument ever had. The escalation didn't come loudly. It arrived dressed as help. A note came home from school asking to schedule a meeting. Nothing urgent. Just a check-in. Rashad forwarded the email to me with a message that said, "Probably nothing, but let's stay ahead of it." Ahead of what? At the meeting, the counselor smiled warmly and asked general questions. How the kids were adjusting. Whether there had been any changes at home. If we felt supported. I answered simply. Yes. No. We're doing fine. Rashad spoke more than I did. Not dramatically. Just enough. He mentioned stress. Transitions. How hard the past year had been for everyone. He never said my name when he talked about it. He didn't have to. I watched the counselor's pen move. When we left, Rashad squeezed my hand again. The same controlled pressure. The same gesture from the party. He said it was good we were being proactive. That it showed maturity. I logged the meeting as soon as we got home. That evening, Kenya called to ask how it went. Said she'd heard the school was checking in on families more lately. The timing was too clean to ignore. 2 days later, Latoya sent a message suggesting I keep a daily mood journal. Just for myself. She said it could help with awareness. I saved it. Each step on its own looked harmless. Together, they formed a trail pointing in one direction. They weren't trying to catch me losing control anymore. They were trying to document that I needed managing. That night, after the kids were asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and felt the doubt creep in. Not about them, but about how long I could keep holding this line. Then I remembered Antoine's words. Patterns matter more than moments. So I closed my notebook, took a breath, and stayed exactly where I was, calm, consistent, and unremarkable. Let them keep moving. Every step they took now was being recorded. The first official move came the following week. Not from court. Not yet. From Rashad. He sat across from me at the kitchen table after dinner, hands folded like he was about to negotiate something reasonable. He said he'd been thinking about the kids. About structure. About making things easier for everyone. And then Rashad finally said the word that changed everything: temporary. A temporary schedule. A temporary adjustment. Just until things felt more stable. I asked what he meant by stable. He hesitated, just long enough to give himself space. Then he said he worried I was carrying too much. That maybe I needed time to reset. That splitting the week differently could help. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why this hadn't come up before. I asked him where the idea came from. He said he'd talked to his family. To friends. To people who cared. There it was. I told him I'd think about it. I asked him to put the proposal in writing so I could understand it clearly. I didn't get an argument. I got an email. His face tightened for a second before smoothing out. He said that made sense. Later that night, the email arrived. Polite. Neutral. Framed around the kids' best interests. Phrases I'd already seen in other messages appeared again, almost word for word. I forwarded it to Antoine without comment. He called me the next morning. This is the pivot, he said. They're moving from observation to positioning. He explained how early concessions, even temporary ones, can become anchors later. How calm compliance can be reinterpreted as admission. Do nothing yet, he told me. Let them escalate. Hanging up, I felt the weight of the moment settle in. This wasn't speculation anymore. It was happening. Rashad came home that evening expecting a response. He watched my face closely, waiting for resistance or relief. I smiled and said I was still reviewing it. The uncertainty unsettled him. For the first time, he wasn't controlling the pace. And without realizing it, he'd shown his hand. The next escalation came wrapped in formality. 3 days later, a letter showed up in our mailbox with my name typed neatly on the front. It was from a guardian ad litem's office, requesting introductory interviews. Neutral language. Standard procedure. No accusations. No urgency. Just an official tone that carried weight. Rashad acted surprised. His surprise felt practiced. He said he didn't know how that happened. That maybe the school had raised concerns. That these things sometimes triggered automatically. I didn't contradict him. I called Antoine instead. He wasn't surprised. He explained how concern can travel through informal channels until it reaches someone with a title. How once that happens, the process starts moving whether anyone intended it to or not. Your job stays the same, he said. Consistency. The interview was scheduled at our home. Sheldon Whitford arrived on time, dressed plainly, carrying a thin folder and a pen. He introduced himself calmly and explained his role. To observe. To listen. To assess. I answered his questions directly. About routines. About discipline. About support. I didn't defend myself. I didn't volunteer extra information. Rashad spoke again more than I did. He emphasized cooperation. Structure. Family involvement. He mentioned Latoya and Kenya by name, highlighting how available they were. Sheldon wrote everything down. When he asked about the birthday party, Rashad framed it as a misunderstanding. Heightened emotions. Everyone meaning well. I said nothing. Later, Sheldon asked me privately if I felt supported. Yes, I said. By the system. That was the truth. After he left, Rashad seemed restless. He asked if I thought it went okay. If I felt heard. I think so, I said. That night, Kenya texted asking how the visit went. Latoya sent a prayer emoji. Concern dressed as relief. I logged it all. They thought they were managing the process. They didn't realize the process was watching them too. The days after the visit felt heavier, like the house itself was holding its breath. Rashad became overly careful. He narrated his parenting choices out loud, like someone making sure they were heard. When he helped with homework, he explained why he chose that method. When he cooked dinner, he mentioned balance, routine, structure. I noted the change without reacting to it. Sheldon followed up with separate interviews. Teachers, the school counselor, a neighbor who'd watched the kids once or twice. People Rashad's family considered friendly, safe. I didn't interfere. Instead, I focused on what stayed consistent. The kids' schedules didn't change. Their moods didn't shift. Their teachers reported no concerns beyond the usual childhood stuff. Normal. Predictable. That normality mattered more than anything else. One afternoon, I received an email from Sheldon asking for clarification on a timeline. Just dates. No opinions. I answered within the hour and attached my log. No commentary. No defense. That evening, Rashad asked if I'd spoken to Sheldon. His voice stayed light, but his eyes searched my face. Yes, I said. He had questions. What kind of questions? Routine ones. He nodded, unsatisfied. Later, Latoya stopped by again. This time with groceries. A gesture meant to look generous. She commented on how calm the house felt. How well I seemed to be handling things. I thanked her. I didn't invite her to stay. After she left, Rashad asked if I thought she was helping or hurting. I think she's being observed, I said. The words slipped out before I could soften them. He laughed, uncomfortable, and said I was imagining things. But that night, I noticed him scrolling through his phone longer than usual. Messages sent. Messages deleted. For the first time, the balance shifted. They were still moving pieces. But they were no longer certain which moves were safe. The call came from someone I didn't expect. Tamika Sinclair's son. A parent I recognized from school events. We'd chatted in passing, shared smiles at pickup, nothing more. Her voice was hesitant, like she wasn't sure she should be calling at all. She said she'd heard about the Guardian ad litem. That someone had mentioned it casually, like gossip. Then she paused and said there was something she felt wrong about. I let her talk. She told me she'd been at the birthday party. That she'd noticed how the comments landed. How they came one after another, from different people, using almost the same language. She said she remembered because it made her uncomfortable. Because it didn't sound like concern. It sounded coordinated. I didn't say anything then, she said. But I wrote it down later. I didn't know why. I just felt like I should. My chest tightened, not with relief, but with gravity. This wasn't just my perception anymore. I thanked her and told her she didn't owe me anything. I didn't ask her to get involved. I didn't explain what I was facing. She asked anyway. When I told her the basics, she went quiet. Then she said something that stayed with me. If this was about helping you, they wouldn't have needed an audience. Antoine agreed. When I told him about the call, he said this was exactly how narratives cracked. Not through confrontation, but through independent recall. Through people who weren't invested in either side, just truth. He warned me not to coach her. Not to rehearse anything. If she spoke, it had to be in her own words. That night, Rashad mentioned Tamika's name casually at dinner. Asked if I'd talked to her recently. I said no. He didn't push, but the question told me everything. The circle had widened. And for the first time, someone from outside their family had stepped into it, not as an ally, not as an enemy, but as a witness they hadn't planned for. That changed the math completely. After Tamika's call, the tone around me shifted again. Not softer. Sharper. Rashad became impatient in small ways. He corrected me in front of the kids over things that didn't matter. Dishes. Bedtimes. Which shoes were appropriate for which weather. Each correction was calm, but public. A record disguised as routine. I didn't react. Instead, I leaned into consistency. Same wake-up times. Same meals. Same bedtime stories. The kids didn't feel the shift the adults were creating, and that steadiness showed everywhere it mattered. Sheldon requested one more follow-up. This time, he asked to speak with someone who'd been present at the birthday party. He didn't say who. He didn't need to. Rashad's family panicked quietly. Kenya sent a flurry of messages about misunderstandings. About how tone could be misread. About how everyone was just emotional that day. Latoya asked if I'd be willing to clear things up privately, woman to woman. I declined. I told Antoine, and he nodded. Said silence now was discipline, not avoidance. That evening, Rashad asked why I was being so rigid. Why I couldn't just reassure his family. I don't need reassurance, I said. I need accuracy. The word landed between us like a line drawn on the floor. Later, I found a draft message open on his phone by accident when he handed it to me to check something. A half-written explanation. Carefully worded. Meant to guide someone else's understanding. I didn't read past the first line. I didn't need to. The next morning, Sheldon emailed to confirm he'd be speaking with Tamika. Rashad read the email over my shoulder. His jaw tightened, just slightly. He said nothing. But for the rest of the day, the house felt different. Not tense. Anticipatory. Like everyone finally understood that the story they'd planned was no longer the only one being heard. The contradictions started surfacing on their own. Sheldon didn't share details, but the questions he asked next told me enough. Dates that didn't line up. Statements that overlapped awkwardly. Descriptions of the party that sounded nothing like concern when placed side by side. Rashad's family tried to close ranks. Kenya called twice in one day, leaving voicemails that sounded rehearsed. She spoke faster than usual, correcting things no one had accused her of yet. Latoya sent a long message about intentions, not actions. About love, not specifics. I saved everything. Rashad grew quieter. Not calmer. Quieter. He stopped narrating his choices and started watching mine instead. He paid attention to what I logged, when I wrote, where I put my phone. At night, he asked questions he already knew the answers to. Did Sheldon reach out again? No. Anyone else talk to you? No. All true. All incomplete. The shift came when Sheldon requested copies of written communications related to the birthday. Not opinions. Messages. Planning. Rashad didn't look at me when he read that email. He folded his arms and said it was invasive. That it was turning into something it shouldn't have been. It already is something, I replied. That night, Kenya posted a vague message online about family misunderstandings and being careful who you trust. Comments piled on quickly. Sympathy. Agreement. People tagging each other. I took screenshots. Antoine called the next morning and said this was common. When private narratives fail, people try to anchor them publicly. Not to prove truth, but to create noise. Let them, he said. Courts don't run on posts. For the first time, I felt something close to relief. They were scrambling. Not because they were guilty in a dramatic sense, but because coordination only works when everyone remembers the same lie. And they didn't. The story was starting to fracture, not from pressure, but from its own weight. He didn't warn me. He filed. The formal filing came 3 days later. Rashad didn't tell me himself. I found out through Antoine, who called and asked if I was sitting down. Then Antoine paused, like he didn't want to say it out loud. He said Rashad had submitted an emergency motion, citing instability and concern for the children's emotional environment. Emergency. The word felt inflated, like a balloon stretched too far. Antoine explained that filings like that were designed to look urgent on paper but rarely held without proof. They weren't about danger. They were about pressure, meant to force reaction and pull the other side into defensive chaos. Did he include specifics? I asked. Vague ones, Antoine said. Which helps you? That night, Rashad came home late. He didn't mention the filing until after the kids were asleep. He said he hadn't wanted it to come to this. That he felt pushed. That he was just trying to protect everyone. I asked him what the emergency was. He didn't answer directly. He said things had been tense. That the kids sensed it. That he worried about unpredictability. Whose? I asked. He looked at me then, really looked, like he was searching for something to point to. I don't know, he said finally. That's the problem. I nodded and told him I understood. I logged the conversation as soon as he left the room. The next morning, Antoine forwarded the filing. Reading it felt surreal. My life flattened into bullet points. Concerns stripped of context. Silence recast as distance. But alongside it, Antoine attached something else. A response draft. Calm. Precise. Supported by dates, logs, screenshots, and third-party accounts. No emotion. No defensiveness. Just facts. This is where patience pays off, he said. For the first time since the party, I wasn't reacting to a move. I was answering it. And I could feel the shift. They had tried to force urgency. Instead, they'd handed me the moment where the record finally began speaking for itself. The response went in 48 hours later. Not rushed. Not dramatic. Filed exactly when Antoine said it should be. The timing mattered as much as the content. It said we were steady. Prepared. Unshaken. Rashad felt it immediately. He started hovering again, but this time it wasn't confidence. It was surveillance. He watched which rooms I spent time in. Asked where I was going even when it was obvious. He offered help where none was needed, then lingered like he was waiting for something to slip. Nothing did. Latoya sent a message asking if we could reset and talk as a family. No lawyers. No misunderstandings. Just truth. I didn't reply. Kenya tried a different angle. She texted about forgiveness. About not letting pride destroy families. About how things could still be handled quietly. Quietly. That word told me everything. The Guardian ad litem requested supplemental statements from both of us. This time, the questions were sharper. More specific. Less patient with generalities. Sheldon wanted dates. Examples. Consistency. Rashad struggled with that. I didn't. I provided the same timeline I always had. I attached the same logs. I referenced the same messages. Nothing changed because nothing needed to. That night, Rashad accused me of turning everyone against him. He said I was cold. Calculated. That I'd changed. I stopped guessing, I said. That's all. He laughed, but it sounded hollow. He said no judge would side with someone who refused to communicate. I didn't argue. Because communication was happening. Just not in the room anymore. And for the first time, I could see the outline of the end, not the emotional one, but the procedural one. The kind that doesn't need shouting to land. The kind that closes doors quietly, then locks them. The waiting became the hardest part. No more moves. No new messages. Just time stretching thin while other people read, reviewed, compared. Rashad tried to fill the silence with forced normalcy. Family dinners. Movie nights. Plans for the future that sounded scripted. I played along for the kids. Behind the scenes, the process kept moving. Sheldon requested one final set of clarifications. Nothing dramatic. Just confirmation. Cross-checks. Small details that only mattered because they lined up across multiple sources. Tamika's statement went in quietly. Not as an accusation. As an observation. Independent. Unprompted. The kind courts trust. Antoine called me after it was submitted. This is the turning point, he said. From here on out, it's about credibility. Rashad felt it slipping. He grew irritable, then overly apologetic, swinging between frustration and forced softness. One night, he said he never meant for things to escalate. That his family had just wanted to help. I asked him why he'd replied the way he did in the messages. He stared at me, caught off guard. I was trying to keep things calm, he said. I nodded. That was always his defense. Calm. Control disguised as peace. The hearing date was set. Once a judge's name is on it, the guessing ends. Seeing it in writing made everything real in a new way. A line on a calendar where speculation ended and judgment began. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table after everyone was asleep and felt something unexpected. Not fear. Readiness. They had used my silence as a tool against me. Now that same silence had been translated into consistency, restraint, and credibility. Whatever happened next wouldn't be decided by who spoke the loudest. It would be decided by who planned the humiliation and who documented it. I expected noise. What I got was rules. The courtroom was quieter than I expected. Not empty. Just restrained. Voices low. Papers shuffling softly. The kind of calm that comes from rules everyone understands without being reminded. We sat on opposite sides, close enough to feel the space between us. Rashad kept his posture steady, shoulders back, expression composed. He nodded to his attorney when spoken to. To anyone watching, he looked reasonable. Concerned. Prepared. I focused on my breathing. When the judge entered, the room shifted. Everyone stood. Everyone waited. This wasn't about impressions anymore. It was about records. The judge opened by clarifying the scope of the hearing. Temporary orders. Custody structure. Best interests of the children. No raised voices. No speeches. Sheldon spoke when asked. Calm. Neutral. He summarized months of observation. Consistency. Stability. Patterns of communication. He referenced the birthday party without embellishment. Described it as a public setting where multiple adults expressed similar concerns in coordinated timing. He noted the presence of recording devices. He didn't assign intent. He didn't have to. Tamika's statement was entered next. Brief. Clear. Independent. She described what she heard and why it stood out to her. No emotion. No allegiance. Rashad's attorney objected once. The judge overruled it without explanation. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my answers short. Direct. I didn't defend myself. I didn't describe how it felt. I described what happened. Across the room, Rashad shifted in his seat for the first time. The judge didn't look at him. She was reading. And as the record unfolded, I felt something settle in my chest. This wasn't a fight anymore. It was an accounting. The judge asked Rashad to explain his concerns. Not generally. Specifically. He spoke carefully, choosing words the way he always did. He talked about stress. Transitions. His desire for stability. He avoided absolutes. He avoided accusations. He framed everything as uncertainty. The judge listened without interrupting. Then she asked about the messages. The coordination. The planning language. The suggestions about letting me talk myself into trouble. Rashad said he'd been trying to keep things calm. That he never intended for anyone to feel attacked. That family conversations sometimes went too far. The judge asked why those conversations were scheduled around public events. Rashad paused. His attorney stepped in, reframing the question. Talking about misunderstandings. Emotional dynamics. The judge thanked him and returned to Rashad. She asked why concern required witnesses. Why the same phrases appeared across multiple phones. Why follow-up actions aligned so closely with family discussions. Rashad didn't confess. He didn't need to. He hedged. Minimized. Explained. And with every explanation, the gaps grew more visible. When the judge addressed me again, she asked a single question. Did you plan that party? No, I said. She nodded and made a note. The courtroom stayed quiet as she reviewed the file one more time. No one rushed her. No one dared. When she finally looked up, her expression hadn't hardened. It hadn't softened either. It was settled. She said custody decisions weren't about volume or optics. They were about intent, consistency, and impact. She said she was concerned not by emotion, but by orchestration. Rashad stared straight ahead. For the first time since the birthday party, he didn't look calm. He looked exposed. The ruling came without drama. The judge outlined temporary custody first. Primary placement with me. Shared legal decision-making. Clear boundaries around communication. Structured schedules. No unsupervised involvement from extended family unless agreed upon in writing. Each condition landed like a door closing. She explained her reasoning slowly, deliberately, making sure it was part of the record. She referenced documentation. Independent witness accounts. The guardian ad litem's observations. She said what concerned her wasn't conflict. It was planning. She addressed Rashad directly then. Said silence could be as influential as speech. That allowing others to speak on your behalf didn't remove responsibility, it redistributed it. Rashad nodded once, stiff. When she turned to me, her tone shifted slightly. Not warmer. Clearer. She said consistency mattered. That restraint mattered. That credibility was built over time, not moments. She reminded both of us that temporary orders weren't punishments. They were safeguards. But the message underneath was unmistakable. This wasn't a tie. As the hearing ended, Rashad's attorney leaned in and whispered something I couldn't hear. Rashad didn't respond. He stared at the table, jaw tight. In the hallway afterward, his family stood in a cluster. Kenya looked stunned. Latoya looked offended, like the outcome was a personal slight. No one approached me. I walked past them without stopping. Not because I was afraid of what they'd say. Because there was nothing left to discuss. The system had spoken. And for the first time since that party, the version of me they'd tried to construct had collapsed under its own weight. What remained wasn't vindication. It was authority. The drive home felt unreal. Traffic moved the same. Radios played. People went about their day like nothing monumental had just shifted. I kept both hands on the wheel and focused on staying present, because my body still expected impact. Rashad didn't come home that night. He texted instead. Short messages. Careful again. He said he needed time to process. That this wasn't the outcome he'd expected. That he felt blindsided. Blindsided. I read the word twice and set my phone down. Later, Latoya called. I didn't answer. She left a message about misunderstandings and hurt feelings. About how families shouldn't let courts divide them. About forgiveness. I saved it. Antoine called to check in. He didn't celebrate. He didn't soften anything either. He said this was a good ruling. A clean one. He reminded me that authority had shifted, but emotions often lag behind. They'll try to reframe this, he said. Privately. That night, I tucked the kids into bed and read the same story Jabari always asked for. Kalia listened quietly, her head on my shoulder longer than usual. After they were asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table and let the silence settle. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. The house no longer felt like a stage. No one was watching to see if I slipped. No one was waiting for me to react. Whatever conversations were happening now were happening without me. And for the first time, that didn't feel like exclusion. It felt like freedom. I went to bed knowing tomorrow would bring consequences I couldn't predict. But the narrative was no longer theirs to shape. It belonged to the record. And the record had already spoken. The consequences arrived quietly. Not through court notices or formal letters, but through absence. Rashad stopped asking questions. His family stopped offering help. The group chats went silent, then disappeared altogether, like rooms that had been emptied overnight. Rashad asked to talk 3 days later. Not in the house. At a coffee shop near the courthouse, neutral ground. He said he wanted clarity. Closure. I agreed. He looked smaller across the table. Tired. His confidence hadn't vanished, but it had lost its armor. He said he never thought things would go this far. That he'd trusted his family to handle things delicately. That he hadn't meant for me to be hurt. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, I told him the truth. Calmly. Without heat. You didn't stop it, I said. You shaped it. He flinched at that. He asked if I hated him. If there was a way back from this. If we could reset, now that things were clearer. I shook my head. I don't need you to understand, I said. I need you to respect the boundaries. He reached for his cup and missed it slightly. The gesture was small, but it told me everything. He was used to managing reactions, not consequences. As we stood to leave, he asked one last question. Did you plan all this? I looked at him for a moment, then answered honestly. No, I said. I documented it. He nodded like that distinction mattered more than anything else I could have said. As I walked out, I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. Not with the process. With the need to explain myself to him ever again. The attempts to regain footing came after that. Not from Rashad directly, but through others. Kenya sent a message framed as concern for the kids, asking if we could normalize things again. Latoya mailed a handwritten letter, heavy on faith and forgiveness, light on accountability. Both avoided the ruling. Both avoided the record. I didn't respond. The parenting app became the only place Rashad spoke to me now. Short updates. Schedule confirmations. Neutral language stripped of emotion. He followed the rules carefully, like someone afraid of stepping off a marked path. That fear showed up in small ways. He arrived early for exchanges and waited in his car. He avoided eye contact. When he did speak, his voice stayed low and measured, like he was afraid volume alone could cost him something. Sheldon closed his file a week later. His final note was brief. Stability maintained. No further intervention recommended. The process that had once felt intrusive ended without ceremony. What lingered wasn't conflict. It was loss of access. Rashad no longer had an audience for concern. His family no longer had a role in decision-making. Their influence didn't explode or get exposed publicly. It simply stopped working. One evening, Rashad messaged through the app asking if we could talk again. Just to clear the air. He said silence felt worse than anger. I typed and deleted several responses before settling on the truth. There's nothing left to clear. He didn't reply. That night, I stood in the kitchen and realized how complete the shift was. The power they'd relied on hadn't been taken from them loudly. It had been removed structurally. No confrontation. No speeches. Just boundaries enforced by process. They could still feel whatever they wanted. They just couldn't act on it anymore. And that, I understood, was the real consequence. Not humiliation. Irrelevance. The first exchange under the new order happened on a Sunday afternoon. Neutral location. Public parking lot. Clear time window. Everything spelled out in writing, so there was no room for interpretation. I arrived early with the kids and waited inside the car. Rashad pulled in a few minutes later. He stayed seated for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, like he was bracing himself. When he stepped out, he didn't come toward my door. He waited. I helped Kalia and Jabari out and walked them halfway across the lot. No lingering. No commentary. Just a quiet handoff. Rashad crouched to hug them. His voice softened when he spoke to them, careful and contained. He glanced up at me once, like he was checking for permission that no longer mattered. "See you later," I said to the kids. They nodded and followed him back to his car. I didn't feel tension as I walked back to mine. I felt clarity. Later that evening, Rashad messaged through the app to say the visit went well. He thanked me for being cooperative. The word sat oddly on the screen, like something borrowed. I replied with a thumbs up emoji and nothing else. That small exchange captured everything. There was no space left for interpretation. No room for emotional leverage. Everything now had a channel, a timestamp, and a boundary. I thought about the birthday party. The phones. The audience. The way they'd tried to make me perform under pressure. Now, the only thing being observed was compliance. And for once, that worked in my favor. As I drove home from the exchange, the sun was setting low and bright, forcing me to squint through the windshield. I slowed down, unhurried. This wasn't a victory lap. It was proof. Proof that control doesn't come from silencing someone in public. It comes from removing the conditions that allowed the silencing to happen at all. The ripple effects reached farther than I expected. Friends I hadn't heard from in months started checking in. Not gossiping. Just asking how I was doing. Teachers became warmer, more relaxed. The tension that had hovered around school events quietly lifted. Tamika stopped me one morning at pickup. She smiled and said she was glad things were calmer now. She didn't ask questions. She didn't pry. She just said, "You handled that with a lot of grace." Grace wasn't the word I would have chosen. But I understood what she meant. Rashad's family faded from shared spaces. They stopped showing up unannounced. They stopped hovering at events. Their presence, once constant, became conditional and distant. That absence was loud in its own way. I noticed it most during moments that used to feel charged. School performances. Parent meetings. Even grocery store aisles where I'd once braced myself for surprise encounters. Nothing happened. No confrontations. No whispered concern. No performances. At home, the kids settled into the new rhythm quickly. Faster than I did. They adapted because the rules were clear. Predictability felt safe to them in a way no explanation ever could. One night, Kalia asked why things felt different lately. I told her we'd made some changes so everyone could feel more peaceful. She nodded and said she liked it better this way. That was the only validation I needed. As I tucked them in, I thought about how much energy I'd spent trying to manage other people's perceptions. How exhausting it was to live under constant evaluation. Now, there was room to breathe. Not because everyone approved. But because approval was no longer required for stability. And that was the quiet miracle I hadn't known to hope for. The moment Rashad finally broke wasn't dramatic. It didn't happen in court or in front of witnesses. It happened on a quiet Tuesday evening, through the parenting app, of all places. He sent a message that didn't follow the usual format. No schedule. No logistics. Just words. He said the house felt empty without the noise. That the silence was heavy. That he'd underestimated how much control he'd lost when he let other people speak for him. He said he felt like everyone was watching him now, measuring every move. I read it once. Then again. And then I closed the app without responding. The next message came an hour later. Shorter. More exposed. He asked if I'd ever forgive him. If I'd planned everything from the beginning. If this had all been some kind of trap. I waited until the next morning to reply. Please keep messages limited to the children's schedule. That was it. No anger. No explanation. No closure offered. The effect was immediate. His replies stopped. The typing indicator appeared once, then disappeared. Whatever he'd been hoping to extract, relief, reassurance, absolution, was no longer available. And I felt it then. The shift complete. He had lost the one thing he'd relied on from the start, access to my emotional labor. He couldn't reframe me. Couldn't provoke me. Couldn't use my reactions to stabilize his own choices. I didn't need him to feel guilty. I needed him to feel irrelevant. That night, as I turned off the lights and the house settled into its familiar quiet, I understood the difference between revenge and dominance. Revenge looks like confrontation. Dominance looks like refusal. And the power in that refusal wasn't loud. It was absolute. Life didn't reset after that. It recalibrated. Mornings stayed busy. Lunches still needed packing. Shoes still went missing right when we needed to leave. The difference was internal. I moved through my days without bracing myself for judgment that never came. The birthday party felt like it had happened in another lifetime. I no longer replayed it in my head, searching for moments I could have handled differently. There was no urge to explain. No need to correct the record. The record existed without my voice now, steady and complete. Rashad followed the rules. That was his contribution going forward. He showed up when scheduled. He communicated through the app. He stayed careful. Distant. Controlled. And that was enough. Not reconciliation. Not forgiveness. Enough. One afternoon, while cleaning out an old bag, I found a folded program from that party. A smudge of frosting on the corner. I almost threw it away, then stopped. Not because it hurt. Because it didn't. I threw it out without ceremony. That night, I stood at the window after the kids were asleep and watched the streetlights flicker on one by one. Ordinary. Quiet. Safe. I thought about how humiliation had been meant to shrink me. To make me reactive. Unstable. Easy to define. Instead, it had forced me to become precise. They thought shouting mattered. They thought witnesses mattered. They thought silence meant weakness. They were wrong. What mattered was intent. Pattern. Proof. And the moment I stopped trying to survive their story and started documenting it, everything changed. I didn't win because I was louder. I won because I stayed. Stayed calm. Stayed consistent. Stayed in control. And when the noise finally fell away, what remained wasn't bitterness or triumph. It was dignity. The kind no one can take from you once you learn how to protect it. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it. If you have a unique story of your own, share it in the comments below. Thank you for listening.